Thank you all very much for coming. I think some of you might have heard Simon and Hanif make an introduction this morning for the option studio that they will be running in London during the spring semester. I know already a lot of people have expressed interest in being part of that. Simon is really an unusual architect in a way, because if I try to think of, well, who in the States would be running a practice which in some ways might have some similarity to what Simon and his colleagues do in their practice, well, I might think that maybe in some ways there is a connection to a practice like Schott, but they're really not like Schott, because they're not trying to, they don't want to be doing development, they don't do design and build, they really are architects, and that's what they do. But as it sort of came up a little bit this morning, I think it is fair to say that the way in which they interact with academic institutions, cultural institutions, developers, consultants, other architects, there's a way in which you can sort of understand their practice as being deeply engaged in the cultural, political structures of the city, and at the same time, they're very much, in a way, a financial model of an organization, as well as a kind of architectural and design studio. And I think that that's a very specific kind of niche, in a way, a very specific position to be working with developers, to be building sort of important, significant projects. And at the same time, Simon, for example, has taught for a long time at University College, at the Bartlett School. He used to run a studio. He has been involved as the Vice President for Education, or something like the Vice President for Education at the RIDA, which is the equivalent of the AIA, and now he is basically the chairman of the Architecture Foundation, which is also the organization that is involved with cultural and educational programs related to the city of London, to London, and to a kind of much wider community. He has a very large practice. Even this morning, every time I've seen the practice is larger. So this morning I said a couple of hundred people, and then he corrected me and said 400. And one thing that you should know is that this practice is obviously doing work in the UK, but actually Simon also has part of the practice in Oklahoma, of all places. Now, why in Oklahoma? And then he has a big group of people working in a city called Bristol, which I didn't know, and I know Simon really quite well, but I didn't know why would he have an office in London, and then like an hour away in Bristol have a very large group of people also working there. The point being that there are structures of opportunity, of friendship, of affiliation, which he's also been able to kind of build on to create new patterns of practice. And I think today there is the question of what is the role and responsibility of the architect of offices, but also what are the organizational structures by which you achieve these goals of trying to kind of deliver buildings. And this offers a very productive, very positive kind of way to at least address this. Not for everybody, but I think it's a very particular and an important model. So please welcome Simon Allford, who will not only show some great buildings, but also hopefully we'll talk about how to get them there as well. So Simon, thank you.
Good evening, it's very nice to be here. Moise made a point about practice, education. I mean, to us, it's always been architecture. We were students when the four partners who formed the firm met. We studied together at the Bartlett. We had a project which we call The Fifth Man. And The Fifth Man was really about an idea of collaboration, but collaboration with an edge, as in it wasn't about swapping notes and working on the same project. We were working individually, but coming together and kind of collaging our own ideas together in an urban project. And we were always very keen, because we came out of an academic background, that what we did was as powerful as it could be. So even now, our model is relatively simple. I lead a studio of about 200 architects. Another of my partners leads a studio of about 150 architects. Two other partners are responsible for what I call designing the practice, which is thinking about people's careers, financial structures, investment in kind of technologies and research and all these kinds of things. And it's all design. It's all design exercise. It isn't really that different. They are designing the office in the way we might be designing projects. But we were 4 when we began, and I think, in the early days we thought we'd never be more than 4. It was pretty tricky. We've become 400. We don't mind if we are 200, as long as it's a slow descent to 200. And we used to say when we were 4, well, we don't want to be more than 10 or 15 or 20. So in the end, we forgot about size, and we just talked about projects. And the kind of simple rule we came up with is, we make money to make architecture. We don't make architecture to make money. Not to say that architects aren't, it's a business, but the business is kind of designed to allow us to do the things we wanted to do when we were young students. And that is to engage in the making of buildings and the constructing of ideas. And that's, in a sense, what the title is about. Having taught for many years and looking forward to teaching a studio in London, architecture exists wherever you want to make it. It's not the sole preserve of architects. In fact, one of the things we're doing now in London is kind of, amongst many other things, is allowing practices to start training people again. Practices used to take responsibility to train people. That all stopped in sort of post-1958. There's a big conference that all stopped. It's not to say that academia is not a great place to train people, but if practices don't get involved in training people, then practices become dumb. They become machines for kind of turning out buildings and not architecture. So there's always another model, and that's what interests us. Can you phase the lights now? Thank you. So I'm going to talk about some of the key ideas that have driven our thinking. This was the Fifth Man, which was our diploma project. This was cutting-edge technology in 1984. It was the Xerox. But it was all about the idea of components in the city, buildings being kind of the thing we were interested in, and then the idea of plots and scales and sizes. It was kind of a collage play on a Monaghan painting, but it was Broadway boogie-woogie. But it was really about the idea that the everyday context of the city is what fascinated us. And we made 2 statements. First, that it is in the field of everyday building rather than public building that modern architecture has failed the city. So that was something we said as students that we were interested in. And the second thing was that functional programme alone, not along, is not sufficient to generate an architecture. So those are 2 things that we were kind of speculating, as you do, kind of laying out your manifesto when you're 21, 22, that we dug up recently, that we thought, well, actually, funnily enough, maybe we haven't been thinking enough, because they're the kind of things we're still actually pursuing now. This is a book. 25 years later, we formed a publishing company. We decided to kind of gather the research that was going on in the office and communicate kind of lectures and things we're interested in. And this was really this idea about the ordinary buildings of the city. And it's not a new idea, it's not our idea. This is Gandhi's illustration of Soane's complete works. Interesting, it was a drawing for the Royal Academy because it kind of highlights one of the tensions that has intrigued us most, and that is the idea about architecture as buildings and architecture as city and aggregations of buildings and the spaces in between, and the tension between the fact that we make buildings for clients, public and private clients. People, we talk about the journey through them, but for most people, architecture is something you only see from the outside. It is the kind of stage set for the city. And this is The Naked City by Guy Debord, and it's that idea about, actually, we all construct our own vision of the city. We all have kind of our own kind of psychogeography, and that is kind of important in the kind of life of our conversation. Our city has always been London, but when we go elsewhere, we're always exporting and importing and exchanging ideas. And in a sense, Guy Debord leads kind of neatly to say someone like Kevin Lynch, and the fact that we all see the world quite differently. So if you construct buildings, it's a question of how do you construct ideas and people to kind of have a shared territory to allow something to become coherent, yet at the same time allow the unknown, the uncertain. This is Kahn kind of understanding the city in terms of the car, a problem that we kind of, I think, redefined many American cities. A kind of optimistic image by Kahn, thinking about this, the kind of idea of castles, gateways, and rethinking the American city. This is Gilray. This is the bank marches. This is another kind of way about thinking about architecture. It's thinking about people, life, and regulation. And it's a thing we always say about buildings is when we talk about them being finished, the moment they're finished is actually when they start. We finish them, but life takes over at that point. And that's a kind of interesting tension. And the people who use those buildings are not necessarily people that you've been commissioned by. They're not necessarily people you know. And they will start to use and adapt that building like they adapt the city in different ways. So we work in a very preserved world. We don't work here in an Italian hill town. We work in central London, but central London is not unlike an Italian hill town. Going back to this idea about use and change over time, there are 10,000 buildings in the city of Westminster, which is one of the two cities of London, all of which are listed, none of which can change, and all of which were commissioned for a purpose for which they're not being currently used. So that's always been a tension to us. A client comes along and asks us to design a building to a program they have, but we're always thinking, well, they're not the user. The user will start to imagine it differently, and it's very, very likely, as we repurpose buildings, that the buildings will actually be used in different ways. And of course, the other great debate in London is, there's the historical fabric, actually the city's San Gimignano, and there's this debate about the new and the old and the skyline and change. And we're in a sort of, probably in the last 40 or 50 years, we're in an era now where people talk much more about the historical state of the place we are in and the context. We are all influenced by context, whatever that context may be. But there's a very powerful force on us in London of constraint. There are virtual fields that mean you cannot enter a certain place because it's a virtual, protected zone because of St. Paul's. There'll be archaeology, there'll be legal constraints. So actually, constraint, I think Charles Eames said, without problems, there's no design. And constraint is certainly something that defines the way we make architecture. But I actually think it's positive. Constraint is the thing that if you don't have it, you kind of need to invent it. This is Osbert Lancaster, the sort of Saul Steinberg of England, London. He invented a town called Drainfleet. This is London night and day. It's about how people live their lives. What's interesting is although he was kind of intrigued by architecture, wrote numerous cartoon books about it, he was always seeing how the public saw architecture rather than how the architect saw it, and the kind of disconnect. Not to deny the import of our discourse, but it's quite an intriguing kind of read to see that kind of alternative view of what we do. So this tension, if you run an office of 400 people, and you're being commissioned to make buildings, there's always this idea about, well, so that's the client's brief, but this building might outlast that client. So what are the rules that we're going to use to make architecture? And it's not to say we should be making black boxes where anything can happen. There's this kind of endless tension. If you make a building where anything can happen, nothing happens. So you have to make specific as well as generic moves. And, in a very strange way, a lot of what we do, this is Jean Prouvé, the great metal worker, but a lot of what we do is actually employing technologies, but we're also employing components. We are assembling buildings as components in a way not unlike cars might be assembled. That's not necessarily a problem. Again, it's something you either embrace or engage with or are disappointed by. But the reality is most of our buildings and their elevations come from another country on the back of a lorry. That may not be something, that may be something that disappoints you, the loss of craft. But this is 21st century industrial construction. Again, this idea of use, opposite ideologies. This is the Casa del Fascio by Giuseppe Tirani in Como. Before the war, it was the Casa, after the war, it was the Casa del Popolo. The culture changed from fascism to communism. The politics changed. The building, outlasted its dubious origins. So a lot of the work we do is in the world of offices. This is, the great office, the Uffizi, for the Medici family in Florence. It incorporated a court, a military system, administrative system, a residential system. It incorporated a public route in the site itself. It also incorporated a private promenade for the sort of popes to move between. So it kind of highlighted the idea that we are making buildings in the city. Those buildings define space, and it's the theatre of everyday life that's actually bringing out, when we go back to visit our buildings, it's the pleasure in a way is not that they've messed the building up. It's the fact that they've actually engaged with it at all, taken control and rethought it, and that the architecture, as in the case here, is robust enough to both cater for that and actually, celebrate it. This is the Nolly plan. I think one of the great debates, really, I show this because public space is obviously known to us in the city. When Nolly drew this plan of Rome, 1748, the churches were the public rooms. Where are our public rooms now? Are they libraries? Are they schools? Security means those buildings are closed up. So we're actually can we bring public space into buildings? I show this because it's the Bradbury building in Los Angeles. I can't remember what it looks like on the outside, but it has a memorable internal space. It's been used in more films than any building I know. And it's that idea about the inside world of the building. And the fact that it happens to have offices around it is irrelevant. It's, again, this idea that it's created a kind of mirror of Nolly's idea of public space within a building. And then this image of Bucky Fuller is that idea of the big idea. As architects, we're always trying to think of the big idea. And there's this endless tension between the smaller idea, the reality of a single building, and then the kind of bigger idea here of a kind of early idea of environmental design. The big idea when we were studying was that, that the internet was going to change the world. I think it may have changed the world in some good ways and in some very bad ways. And we're kind of trapped into kind of iPhones and technologies. But there was also this idea that, certainly in the UK, people said people would disappear and live in rural Wales and wouldn't go to a place like London. In fact, what's happened is the kind of machines tend to isolate us into a kind of cyber world, and then actually physical kind of engagement is increasingly important. And then that's the idea of, this is Petra, and the idea of containment, and again, the idea of actually the pleasure of the city is the uncertainty, the idea that Manhattan's a regular grid, London's an unplanned city, they say. It's actually a very planned city. It's just been planned by different people over different times. But in a way, the ad hoc juxtaposition of buildings and spaces in London is what allows very, very different things to go on. It's not to say it's better, it's just different to Manhattan. And in a sense, architecture, I think what we're always thinking about is how do you play with the kind of the generic, which is the gridded city that's Manhattan, and the specific, which is the kind of uncertain collision of events that's London, and exploit that within your architecture. This is Hogarth. This is called Midnight Conversations. I was with a very eminent architect on a kind of architectural tour of buildings. We're in a rather rubbishy marquee that had a tent lining. He's built all over the world, and he turned around to me and said, that's the problem. He goes, you could only do so much with architecture. What he was really saying was, this place we were in hadn't been designed, but it worked. That is not to say we shouldn't be designing things, but it kind of suggests that maybe we should be thinking about the limits of architecture. Cedric Price had a story that he worked with a couple on a building for 3 months. They wanted an extension, and after 3 months he said, look, you don't need an extension, you need a divorce. And the point about that was really to say, a great school of architecture is helped by being in a great building, but probably more important is the culture of the students and the culture of the staff. Architecture can do so much. I'm fascinated by it, but it can do so much. So universal use is something that we kind of talk about in the projects we're doing, and that is the idea that the irrelevance of kind of planning constraints to talk about particular uses. And we started to think of this in a very simple kind of way that we drew up for an exhibition we were doing. It's about a field, it's about a constraint, it's about the idea that the architecture we make is the theatre of life, it's the physical frame, it might last 50 years, it will last 100 years. Then there are these stage sets, which is the kind of temporary projects of life that might last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And then there are props, the kind of reconfigurable components of people's life. When you design an apartment block for 400 people, as we do, you're not considering their props. You're making the kind of theatre for their life. The stage set might be the fact you might have a swimming pool or a running track or a garden on the roof. But it's that idea about how much do you want to control. So what I'll now show you is a series of projects that talk about the journey, the idea of how do you get to the other side. What are the things that drive your thinking? I will start by really reflecting on some of the early projects we did and the ideas, and then later on I'll talk about some of the projects we're doing now and the forces that inform those ideas. The first project we did, the kind of classic project, was a house in a garden. It was a kind of very, very tight, controlled vessel, as we saw it, for life. Upside down, so the windows on the floor, so this kind of very, very specific, a kind of generic barn-like volume, but a very specific elevational tact. It was a swimming pool. It had some living accommodation. We've recently reworked this house. It's now a living room. And everyone walks in and says, well, how interesting that you put all the windows on the floor. We have to explain that wasn't the driving idea, but it also shows that the driving idea is the generic isn't actually enough, and the specific, if it's delightful, can allow you to do something else. This is Kaster, which is early social housing for a Quaker research organisation called Joseph Rowntree. It stands for city apartments, single people, affordable rents. We did this project with Hanif. It was very, very, very low cost, so it was equivalent of $50,000 a unit, which in England was kind of nothing. Hanif and I came up with this simple idea of the social space of the building was the most important thing, and we would pull the corridor apart and address the critique of modern post-war housing, which is always this streets in the sky that failed, and create an internal courtyard that was the kind of social space. You never walked under someone, you saw through it, there was light, there was a social space, there was a garden at the bottom, there was a roof at the top. Very, very simple project, very, very simple organising idea, but when you have a small housing project, it's perhaps simplicity is the best way. This was an early competition we won for a new model of sustainable school. It's not a word I like. We talk now about environmental design and building performance, but it was really thinking about how a school in a rural community could become the social space. There was a very, very particular brief. There was no money to innovate. So what we kind of worked on was if we actually designed a tighter, more efficient school, we could reinvest the kind of money that we were losing in building less volume and think more imaginatively about how the building could be used out of hours. A very, very simple, naturally ventilated, highly insulated building, and a simple organising device of a plimsoll line that anchors it to the low-lying East Anglian landscape. It's also the device that kind of caters for the fact that in the design process, we knew with the uncertain client we had things would change. That black line can absorb the changing brief of different rooms, different windows, different engagements. So very kind of hard, practical idea shaping. And then wherever possible, to create something extra from this tight brief, external sheltered space. That led to another competition we won, which was the brief was to design 18 bus stands, and there was a kind of highways engineer map of this city centre and where you would pick up buses. Our competition winning idea was to gather those, to redesign the highway structure, gather those buses underneath a single 120 metre by 80 metre elliptical concrete roof, and then create a new public square on the basic idea that bus travel for the kind of less wealthy in the area should have a certain civic importance and dignity, and that our job in a way was to liberate the project, was to actually rethink the brief. And then there was this idea that the buses even aren't regulated, the quality of kind of environmental pollution from those buses is not controlled, but the architecture could at least give a certain dignity to the place, kind of recognise that the everyday life of the city could become an important kind of social space. And even now, revisiting this project 15 years on, it has been smashed to bits in many ways, but the space is there. This building's been kind of heavily brutalised, but in a sense it doesn't matter because the organising devices exist, the social space exists, and the rest of it is kind of life. And as Le Corbusier said, life is always right. Early, again, another competition winning scheme was this idea about prefabrication. People talk about, in the new world we'll be prefabricating or printing now. This was for Peabody, and this was kind of social housing. And the idea was to kind of use the discipline of the prefabrication to develop a different kind of housing layout, so that we weren't designing houses and making prefabricated modules. We were starting with prefabricated modules and developing an idea of housing, and the idea that you could incorporate everything into the building. And then the idea that the social space, the streets on the sky, a bit like Kaster, were a different way of thinking about it, and we're allowing people to adapt and take over and transform and engage with their own space. So if buildings are always being, our buildings are going to be adapted. To us, when I began, the idea of working on historical buildings was of less interest, but increasingly, in a way, the moment we get given a site, one's thinking much more about what have we got, what can we do. It might be a clear site, in which case there are invisible constraints, or in this case, this was a site that a client bought. It's 5 different buildings, a series of warehouses, none aligned. But in a way, it's an architectural version of the map of London. Nothing's been planned, and there's a kind of chaos and a set of conflicts. But you can harness that. So the simple rule we made here, again, taking the constraint of an economic blip in 2000, was to say that everything we did was minimal impact, and you either found within the building or recycled from somewhere else. So the building itself was a series of collisions over time. This is the entrance. This is the shipping container we bought for £300. These are the American postal boxes we bought for $12. Just a series of elements coming together. But then, wherever possible, exploit the fact that there was an industrial roof, there was a lightweight north light system. We could strip that off, take technology from sports centres and make a removable roof. And then as the building became more successful, and we've been working on this building non-stop for 15 years, we could add a swimming pool, a series of gardens, and a series of other elements. So a building that a client was going to tear down, that we were doing a meanwhile use for, has now become too valuable for them to kind of pull it down, which is quite an interesting idea about kind of what I would call long-term environmentally smart thinking. The reality is, the frame of this building was fundamentally good. The skin has been upgraded, but actually the frame was good. The collisions, the incidents were interesting, and therefore the opportunity to make architecture another kind of way existed. Talked about big ideas. This is the Barbican. This was a very big idea in London after the war, heavily bombed city centre. We'll build a new cultural centre for the city, concert hall, art galleries, library, restaurants. But the big, brave idea at the time was that no one in London would walk on the street. Everyone would walk either at first floor on decks right across London, or they would arrive underground by car. So what you had was a 3,000-person concert hall with no front door. So the project we've been working on for 15 years has actually been to kind of rethink a big idea. So there's the kind of heroic brutalism of the Barbican. There's the new entrances we've cut. This is the kind of art project we developed. This is still a vehicular entrance because it's the only way you can get trucks in, but it's become a people entrance with occasional vehicles rather than vehicles with people fighting to get through. This is the idea of choice, and again, that idea about freedoms. This building allowed anyone to go anywhere, and as a result, no one could navigate that building at all. So our master plan was really to reduce choice and make sure people picked up a set of single decisions at each stage as they moved through the building. And then started kind of the artistic idea at the time was that the art would be kind of spread throughout, and then of course as a reaction to that, and I think we might swing away, but the reaction to that was to turn it back into white box galleries within the building. Building's really important to us, and the discipline of making and learning from that, and this is one of our early projects in terms of tall buildings. It's a residential building with an interlocking section using a Dutch tunnel form construction and an office building here on the World Heritage Site that is the kind of Liverpool Waterfront. A very, very tough project, really difficult to work through. I think we were only 7 or 8 people when we did this project. A huge learning curve, but again, the constraint and the discipline of making architecture has definitely continued to inform everything we do. This is a similarly tough project. This is the edge of London. There's London as we know it in the background. That's the city. This is Barking, a former fishing port. It's a London borough, but it's very distinct. It's very impoverished. It's failed since Ford failed. And this was really about making a series of buildings around its old civic centre, and then making a mature new public space, in this case collaborating with MUF, landscape architects. And then the idea that, we would master plan the building and we'd bring social spaces into it. We'd create a new library. We'd create some new high-rise, very, very simple low-cost building. We'd create some new residential and a hotel. Projects spin across time to each other. Again, this the discipline of making. This is Adelaide Wharf, which was an interesting government-promoted idea that we needed to provide housing in London. We've always needed to provide housing in London. If you read the kind of post-war reports, they'll say 4 million new houses required over the next 20 years. If you read the reports now, they'll say 4 million houses required over the next 20 years. There must be a secret network of living going on in London, because you don't find people sleeping rough. There is a sort of a kind of black market that exists, a kind of subculture of accommodation. But Adelaide Wharf was about building private, social, and what they call intermediate, which is a mix, all in the same block around the same social space. Again, working with Hanif. It's on the canal in Hackney, which was then a kind of tough place that's now a kind of rather wealthy place as the city spreads out. And the discipline here was to not do what we did at Rainsdale, which was to use prefabricated modules, but to see if everything could be made using industrial systems. So even the reinforced concrete frame is a standardized rollout construction. The balconies were made in the north of England. The facade was made in Czechoslovakia. Everything is an assemblage, but then to make a very specific to its site, its waterside site building. And then because the facades can carry no load, the whole thing is hung from the roof, structurally inefficient, but again kind of allows us to kind of take through a method of making to establish a method of architecture. And the kind of, this is one of the entrance into the shared courtyard, the discipline we kind of gave to ourselves beyond the prefabrication was that every apartment should have twice the external area that would normally be allowed, which meant you get these 12 square metre balconies. And the idea was that this was the kind of a proper garden, a yard, a front yard or a backyard in the sky. And then it was the kind of the social face overlooking the park of these developments. Rather amusingly, Dustin Hoffman and Dame Judi Dench, then there was a film made built around this particular project, which is about a love affair across the balconies. So even in the prosaic industrialised construction of making housing, there is poetry to be found by others in what you've done. This was for a client we'd worked for, the benefit of kind of surviving as a practice. A client we'd worked for many years on a series of industrial buildings by motorways, but in central London. And when he wanted to build a new building, what we knew, he runs a fashion business, that there was a kind of visual chaos, that what he really needed was a large, multi-layered warehouse for people to do things. But at the same time, he's a kind of visionary guy, and he's built up a very large art collection. And the opposite to what happened at the Barbican, here art is dispersed throughout the building as the kind of subliminal visual and cultural messaging, communication to the staff about the thinking that's underpinning what they might be doing in design. It's in a kind of central West London. There's Mario Testino's studio in the foreground. It's a very simple industrial shed, but over 8 floors. It's kind of a series of tight spaces we're trying to make to contrast with the kind of loose, large space of the motorway. And then internally, we developed this idea of a bespoke handmade frame contrasting to all the work we've done on prefabrication, but using the skill of the maker, the chippy, the formwork chippy, and then a very simple idea that Hanif's team came up with, that the structure would basically stay the same width. You would just play with the way you position the formwork, and as you moved up the building, the structure would get lighter, so the structure would actually express the load patterns. It's cheaper not to express the load patterns, but as we felt, we'd stripped architecture away completely within the building, and it was pure structure. The structure is the architecture of the building. So here you see within the building, it's 2, what we'd call 15 metres, you would call 50-foot floor plates, pulled apart, not unlike that Kaster housing project. But again, a similar idea of circulation through the middle, a series of staircases. This is the cast and hollow, one of the art pieces. And then the idea of the visual connection. It's one of the biggest challenges on this project. Again, that idea about detail and research. And the more you make, the more you're able to push constraints. This is a single fire envelope, so we didn't have to subdivide the building up. We could allow the atrium to be the air return for the air conditioning, and it could also deal with fire. And then here you see the visual chaos of the floor, and then the art embedded and scattered throughout the project. And then this is what we knew would happen, and in a way that's fine, because the architecture is there and life is going on. This is a similar kind of idea for a school, a low-cost school. At the time, a friend of mine, he was a furniture designer, he put on an exhibition called Mummy, Why is Modern Architecture So Grey? And when we went to this site, there were these series of quite heroically detailed brutalist social housing elements. And our natural reaction at the time, maybe from the fact that when we'd been short of money, the degradation of these buildings was quite alarming. So we decided to revert to an ancient material. So this is glazed terracotta, use saturated colour and contrast, a new way of inserting a building into this urban landscape. And then you can see in the background the towers, and then this idea of actually the permanence of the educational facility contrasted with the much more ephemeral sports facility, which will change and weather in a different kind of way, the informal and the formal. Again, like the earlier school, one of the biggest parts of the project, again reinventing the brief, was to make the school work out of hours. Schools work for about 20% of the time. Most of the time they're empty. Think of holidays, think of the short school hour. So the idea was to make this building a community facility to extend well beyond school hours. And then it's a simple, robust building, imprinting on the concrete, no artistic collaborations here, but working with the graphic designer, and then working with the children to engage that first generation of children in the design. This is a multicultural, there's 102 languages spoken here. The idea that the global connectivity of London, the fact that I think 60% of the children, English was the second language, this idea of actually, celebrating their engagement in the making of the building. This is Alan Bennett, the playwright. Medical buildings are probably the most difficult to work with in any country. They're driven by a very tough set of rules. The first one we did was a childcare facility, and we worked with Jackie Poncelet, the artist, on the basic idea that if we turn the public space into an art project, the natural tendency of the National Health Service to institutionalise and make everything miserable would be actually controlled by art. And then that ran into this project, which was a competition we won for a new mini hospital. It's 60,000 feet. A simple idea about, actually, we just set a basic rule. There are mature trees on the site. We would build this building and not damage or remove any. It led to a very complicated foundation system. But then the building breaks down, and then the trees become the environmental filter and bring light into the building. There's a garden that opens up, there's a street through it, and the different layers, as the building gets more private, are all visually connected. And the most basic tasks are continuously about looking through and seeing and breaking down that fear of 21st century medicine. Art galleries, this is the ultimate, people get very intrigued by art projects. This is a project we worked with Charles Saatchi on. Very clear brief to us. He was in a listed building. He said, I do not want to be in a listed building. We worked for 5 years to find him a warehouse or some other element to be in. And 5 years later, we found a listed building in the middle of London. It was a former school that became an orphanage that was then used by the army and was being turned into an office block very, very simple building, which we then took, gutted, and made a simple series of white spaces. The only distinguishing thing about this building, apart from the difficult technology of inserting these spaces into the found structure, was the idea that the entire circulation system, unlike many galleries, would be through the galleries itself. And it's very much an idea of architecture as the background to his collection, which you'll notice is very minimal in its presentation. This was actually a double-height office space. In fact, Hanif was doing this as an office when we got involved and asked to take up various floors within it. And then again, reappropriating. This is Richard Wilson's art, a very specific piece he'd made in the previous gallery that was then reconfigured. This is a kind of 2mm viscous oil reflective surface reconfigured into the basement. This idea of use and reuse, and then that idea of the Nolly plan and public space. This is an office building. We extended it, we reworked it, and then we had this idea of pushing security further and further back into the building so that the atrium that we'd created in what was a former courtyard, so we doubled the amount of building on the site, but almost invisibly, would then become a public room within that would make the offices valuable, but also kind of engage with the city. And then this idea of endless visual connection. And again, this idea that in a sense, it's our tribute to the Bradbury building, architecturally different, but it's the idea of a promenade of public circulation through a private building, ending up on a public roof terrace. The idea of, making money to make architecture means you balance and play with the scales of projects you're working with. This is a hospice in London. Again, a little competition win. Very tricky project, not because we wanted to deinstitutionalize this and make it kind of almost feel like a very large house. But the guidelines are all about germs. Bear in mind that people are very weak after serious cancer treatments and they're terminally ill. But it was really very much about trying to kind of pick up on the domestic scale of the area, bring natural materials into the house. But the small business of bringing bricks with mortar into a house, a hospice, required someone for about 3 or 4 months to prove that this was not a germ trap. It's a tiny thing, but it's that idea about detail in architecture driving what you do. This is another school, but this time for the Olympic Village, which is a kind of proto-Stalinist construction in East London. We were involved in the master planning, but when it became too Stalinist, we pulled out. And we made the only public building on the site, which is pivotal in that it was addressing old Leytonstone and the new Olympic Village. And that really informed its design idea, which is this simple circular drum. It also referenced the fact that our work on studying in the residential plan, the Great London Estates, we don't build churches anymore. The school is the marker building. It's a simple drum. The cowls are to do with a natural ventilation system that's dealing with acoustics. And then this idea of, again, that the school becoming a public building and then accepting the fact that the school will take over the life of the interiors, and then working with a talented landscape architect on the idea of play and engagement and a kind of green space that contrasted with the harder spaces around them. And then working with Hanif on the whole project, but also this idea of a bridge as a simple expression of an entrance into the place, and also the idea of expressing the stress and tension and spanning potential of the structure. I talked about stage sets. This is London's greatest stage set. It's Regent Street, an extraordinary place in that it was built really for these buildings, and these very grand facades were only 8 foot thick. So they were 1 room thick grand facades of great palazzos, replacing John Nash's original design. So what's happened over the last 15 years is all of Regent Street, which still looks like this, has been completely rebuilt behind. And we worked on 2 buildings and 3 public spaces. And you see the odd new element of new building coming through. And then in side streets, this is Keith Tyson, Turner Prize-winning artist. And then here's this idea of highly valuable real estate, naturally ventilated office building, triple glazed skin, very expensive way of making a building, but this is a very, very valuable part of London. And the client is called the Crown Estate. So ultimately the money goes to the government, but it used to be owned by the Queen. They've owned the land since 1066, so if they can't make a long-term play on architecture, no one can. And what's interesting in London is the artistic programme. This is Rona Smith, gate into his little secret courtyard. This is Alison Wilding, the artist, a piece she made called Shimmy that was kind of responding to the spaces we'd made within the courtyards. So this idea of the kind of artistic, architectural and urban programme, and the fact that all the clients we're working with here have a long-term engagement with architecture. They are the people who will retain the building after we've finished, whereas those who build and sell have a completely different view. And of course, that means you can kind of rethink Regent Street and it becomes a kind of almost like a public park on the roof. You get this slightly surreal vestigial-like apartment on the top. This was a key project for us because it was about building low-cost schools where we were not working for a client, we were working for a contractor. And those of you who work with contractors will know that's about the worst place you can be. So what they're interested in is efficiency without necessarily any delight. But we kind of worked with them enough researching precast systems to develop a simple 4-panel type that would go over 6 buildings over a 10-year construction period in a phased redevelopment of the school while the school stayed in place. So plenty of constraints, but actually the simplicity of the idea, obviously kind of referencing Marcel Breuer, the simplicity of the idea of rotating these panels, creating simple cut-throughs, creating a kind of architecture of relationships between these buildings, thinking about the idea of campus, accepting that we had to build one, move another, whilst shuffling the students into another. All those disciplines actually forced everyone in the team, and eventually the school as a client who came on board halfway through, to think much more imaginatively. And we obviously retained certain buildings. We created certain new buildings that were, had relationships with those retained buildings. And then this idea about actually, how do you find a poetry in the system of construction? And then, actually, again, learning in a sense from Regent Street about the idea of stage sets. Internally, the facades are just a game. They are just an abstract pattern. And internally, you'll find double height volumes, triple height volumes, and strange relationships within. A much more public function is a library. We're in the one today in Cambridge. And this is the idea of actually kind of looking at the area, looking at the polychromatic brickwork, taking ourselves out of our comfort zone and experimenting with kind of bonds and patterns and kind of focusing, again, a client contractor on thinking about a way of making and persuading them to do this with this idea that if you make good brickwork and you get rid of finishes, you can actually reduce time on site. And it's time, not materials, that are costing money. And then that runs through into the interiors. And then this idea of social space and engagement, and the idea, of course, that a public room is for all kinds of people to sleep and relax and use in different kinds of ways. And the same, Google are a client of ours. We're working with them in London and in Berlin and elsewhere. It's here, they've always loved the image of being a dynamic business, but actually what they do is actually very, very static. It all has an image of response and change, but actually it tends to be an image. So this project was really about stripping a building back to its shell, creating a series of pieces of furniture, creating a promenade that dealt with a disconnect of an atrium in a building they found themselves in that none of us had designed or thought was particularly of great merit. And then making sure that this journey through the building, like the journey through the city, like the journey through the Bradbury building, was actually a kind of an urban journey. And then it was about developing a simple idea that where does architecture exist in the world of interiors? To us, it existed in an idea about CNC routers and demountable rooms that could be kind of taken down and reconfigured by the individuals who work there, rather than the appearance of change. This is real change. So we designed a simple room that took about a year to perfect. And the idea is we ordered 200 up from a large joinery company, but you could order one cassette up from via CNC router from a very small business. We called it Project Jack. It's an idea of kind of demountable, easily handleable components. And then that idea of Jack run through to all the elements we installed in the building, all the furniture. So the idea of taking architecture down to a kind of much more detailed level. And this, in a way, was an exercise in the idea of rather than theatre or stage set, but in the idea of props. There's the kind of classic, obvious symbol of the off-the-shelf sleeping pod that I don't think anyone's ever used. Reuse again, in Liverpool, a theatre, no budget, quite a fine 1920s building. We created a kind of new street frontage that didn't exist, stripped the building back to its minimum, and again, in this Jack-like idea, inserted a series of pieces of furniture, and then really just got back to the idea of what we'd call a zero finishes building, which again is a lesson that feeds into our new buildings. And then, of course, this is a kind of architecture imitating art. This is an Edward Hopper Nighthawks-like shot, but with a slightly less glamorous casino in the background. By contrast, but at the same time, we were working on New Scotland Yard, which is a highly complex, secure government building, next to Norman Shaw's buildings. This is Wallace Green. And this is kind of pure architectural technology. This is structure-free, bomb-proof glass. I think it's about 4 inches thick. So what we're trying to do is make a very public building from a very secure site. It was launched on the day of the attack on Westminster Bridge, so it's, you know, it kind of, the eternal flame is a kind of important symbol of the challenge of security. But in a way, this is the most extreme version. All buildings have this kind of fear of public engagement. But the more you can persuade people to actually open their buildings up, the more successful they become. So if a building's enjoyed by the public in the widest sense, it becomes part of the city and it becomes successful in many, many different terms. The other projects I'm going to talk about really are about actually removing and remaking in London. This was a kind of challenge to us to pull down 3 listed buildings and make a new marker building. We conceived of it as a glass vitrine, a kind of triple glazed city sandwich with retail, with offices and with residential. And we had the challenge of kind of sculpting the glass. And actually, the more we sculpted it, the more it became reflective, the more it became opaque and contrasted, obviously not internally, but externally. And then obviously there was this kind of strange idea about flamboyance and could we make a corner, and about reflecting the changing grids of the building. And then this is the corner itself, which became a light sculpture. We worked on in-house with a lighting specialist. This is the building at Christmas. The idea is that, in a sense, to kind of get out of our own constraints, our slightly tight architectural world. This is another city sandwich, as I'd call it. So this is a school, an office, 1,100 apartments, a studio, and a local sports centre down the road from Big Ben and Westminster Abbey. And then the simple idea here was to abstract the 1,100 rooms into a series of slits, into a large kind of sculptural insertion, a kind of spun top that reflected the kind of incoherent urban language of the place. So a lot of the buildings we've been working on are very coherent places. This is an incoherent place, and each building is, in a sense, trying to make its own mark. This was the simple idea of whatever is happening within, the building was legible within the city. And then, in fact, this is the promenade going through the city. This is the school, which is actually housing 800 students. This is the communal spaces on the roof, again, open for the public of the building. So that's the 5 different groups who work there. And then this is the idea of the individual slots being very anonymous on the outside, but being very specific in how they capture views. This project is, again, the kind of the biggest reuse project we've done. It's 1.5 million square foot in Amsterdam. Competition we won 10 years ago. It's slow architecture. There was an existing 1960s building, 200 metres long. Our competition-winning idea was actually to remove space from the site, to cut a large hole, because we felt the building blocked off one half of the city from another and had disconnected the university from the city. So by inserting a 60-metre concrete beam, we propped up the building and removed 40,000 feet below and allowed the canal to flow back through. And suddenly, it is a university campus, but it's now a university campus. This is in construction. It was, when we won the competition, we said to the client, you know, none of you will be here when we finish this building, because we know the turnover in universities is relatively quick, not here, obviously. So we've had 4 different clients in the course of the project, but it hasn't really mattered. Who's going to be in this building hasn't really mattered, because what we were doing through these moves was connecting it to the city. Then through this series of devices, this what we call the cut, and then the bridge, we are creating the kind of network of social spaces within the building, regardless of who would be in there. And then the idea of the outsides is a simple neutral veil. But then these social spaces within are kind of clear and coherent, and actually who's been in and who's coming out has continuously changed. In fact, the building's only just completed itself. But saturated colour in certain points, restraint in other areas. We couldn't replace the lifts, so we added extra stairs we refer to as the kind of mini atrium. So instead of moving along a 200-metre floor zone, you cluster around vertical elements. So it almost created a series of houses within the building. And then we had this idea of the 300-person lecture halls sort of docking in the basement, and then everyone walking on top of them and then travelling down through. So the building became almost like a multi-layered liner within the city. And they bring their art into the project. This is Barbara Brookman. And then this is the idea of a passage that we created in a place that was previously a void. So again, learning from the Barbican, you're suddenly making an inaccessible 60s system that, like the Barbican, was first floor entry only, re-engaging it with the city. So I'll end really by just talking about those are projects, they're ideas that reflected the conversations we had as students. They're ideas that have bounced off other projects over time. There's always this idea about learning from your own mistakes, but also learning from your own lessons, and talk in a little more detail across 3 or 4 projects about the idea of making. This is our office. There's 12 model makers continuously making models for our purposes, but a lot of it being one-to-ones and prototyping, because what we normally find is the construction process is too slow. So wherever possible, we're trying to get ahead of that process. This is the white-collar factory, which Hanif has moved into. We started this project in 2008. As the client said, there's a famous line of Winston Churchill's in the First World War, "Gentlemen, we have no money, we have to think." The problem of 2008, obviously globally, was quite significant, and that was rather useful. So instead of saying what they wanted, they started to say, well, what do you think we should do? And we went through this idea of actually what was an office building, and the key drivers about generosity, robustness, efficiency of system, the universality and the potential of it, the passive systems. I mean, our buildings have become incredibly complicated with incredibly cumbersome technologies that no one actually uses properly. And then we came up with some simple ideas. I mean, nothing, it's kind of rocket science because it's contradicting all the stuff that's gone before. But if you have tall ceilings, heat rises, where the space you occupy works better. If you get rid of air conditioning, naturally ventilate, but make your thermal mass actually active rather than passive, so we have cold water pipes cast to the slab, the whole thing is radiating cool. Rather than shade the facade, we actually don't let the sun in. We create deep plan because we know that the kind of shallow space doesn't work, and we use a concrete structure for everything, which works on a theory of convergence that we're interested in, which is that, in a way, when we make a building like this, nothing can be taken away. There is no redundancy, and nothing need to be added. It doesn't mean you may not want to put delight and detail in, but it's about an economy and eradicating finishes and the layers of clutter that arrive in an architectural construction. We treated it as a research project. For 2 years, we worked on the idealized building. We knew we'd never build this idealized building, but it was a kind of structural, and architectural and environmental testing system. We then arrived on a site in London where this idea of efficiency becomes something quite different. The core moves, the walls change, the building's articulated in different ways, but the fundamental moves are still there because we know that site and constraint is always going to be part of making architecture. The environmental strategy remains. The building then moves to a particular place, which is Silicon Roundabout in Old Street. There's a taller building. There's 5 other buildings, 3 new ones, 2 retained. We work through a series of models, and because we've worked with the same client for 20 years, we persuade them to build a £1.5 million mock-up, jacked up 20 metres in the air, to test the way you make the building. But actually, economically, if you're building £200 million worth of construction, this kind of thing is incredibly useful. This was then actually used not really for marketing, but for testing the environmental performance of the building. This was really the story about the positive story about engaging with CO2, carbon, and therefore we could make this very complex, tight site in London and make this new 500,000 square foot suite of buildings that are they're LEED platinum, they're BREEAM outstanding. I think those measures are useful checks, but they're not the driver. It's a very solid building, but actually quite light within. It has this kind of light filtering system that also allows for natural ventilation and takes the wind and the edges off it. It exposes it's making at the ground. The system above is an industrial facade system, but detail comes into the building in terms of the castings and how we make the concrete, how actually the system breaks down, where the core engages with the wall, and then the idea of the interior space, this idea of convergence. So the structure is the finish, is the space. We use a kind of timber formwork to articulate certain walls. The client become a very big fan of architecture. And we buy Jean Prouvé's low-cost industrial facades for £70,000 a pop from an art gallery in Paris, which is a kind of rather ironic comment on Prouvé's work in making architecture affordable. And then we work on very simple ideas about easy accessibility, visibility, raw floor plates, the occupation of floor plates with jack-like systems, the idea of detail and light, and the standard notion in London is just give me glass. Well, it's irrelevant. Actually, framing views is better. That actually the industrial system that is ventilating this building, providing fresh air when the natural ventilation can't be used, is kind of part of the veins in a way of the building, the facade, the detail, the framing of views, the engagement with London, and then actually, if you're spending money in a different kind of way, you can liberate the way you think of the building. So the ground floor is a public space for the city. There's an outdoor public space, and on the roof, there's a club for the building users. And again, this idea of convergence, that's the building in the city. And when it was launched last week, all people wanted to talk about was the running track. But that's a removable train where the building maintenance unit goes. So it's doing lots of things. And that really is, what intrigues us is putting suites of buildings together now. This is Camden Town, mixed uses, kind of a palette of different materials. Already this client is changing this from a market building into an office building. And then this complexity of making an industrial infrastructure and railway lines running through is kind of beneficially challenging the way we think about aggregating buildings. And then here's this idea about universal space with a 12-metre deep basement in a bottom-down, top-up construction. The last two projects I'll show are really about reuse, but on a kind of much bigger scale, and what it can bring to the city. So this is this is Gin Lane. This is Gin Lane, Beer Alley. That's Hawksmoor's Church. This is Bloomsbury in London. That's the same spire you can see there, here, and that's Senate's House in the background and the British Museum beyond. It was an industrial building built with great generosity for a system we no longer use called the Post. It has an underground railway line that links it to London. We have to keep that open. It's used for data and cable transfers. It's a rather anonymous but quite intriguing building. But what distinguishes it and is unique is it has 6 metre or 19 foot floor-to-ceiling heights. So our design idea was to retain this kind of magnificent suite of found objects and spaces, reinsert it into the city, create an industrial-scaled new facade to clear out the unnecessary components, to put new cores through the building. This is the lacquered steel, the stainless steel trims, and the kind of heroic scale of the facade. This is a typical floor plate. And then there's an interesting idea in London that the strange brief for this site is 500,000 square foot of office space and 50 social housing units and a public roof garden. It's kind of weird and absurd, but what happens is you get McKinsey's on the top worrying that people can look in the windows and see what they're doing, and then you've got the social housing tenants right underneath them. So it's that kind of strange juxtaposition, and again, this idea of a layered city and bringing public space through the city and then creating this public garden and shuffleboard and track within the city. And then the making of it is consuming 20 architects for the next 3 years. And the retention of the structure is a kind of absurdity, but we knew the moment you took it down, you'd never get the volume back. So we've persuaded the client through various devices, also on the basis that there is something about the uniqueness, the specific of having 1 acre floor plates on a volume and scale that's not known. The last project I'm going to talk about is a thing about slow architecture and time. So if we finish and the life of the building starts, this is the timeline of a project that we started in 2006, late 2006. Here, 10 years on, we're a year and a half off starting on site. It's right in the middle of London, junction of Tottenham Court Road at Oxford Street. There was a theatre on the site. A thing called Crossrail came along, and Crossrail is infrastructure. And what happens when you make infrastructure is you lose the buildings above where you come out of that infrastructure. This is what we're doing. So it's eye of a needle stuff. There's a new theatre, a new office building. This is the site now. And what we have in a kind of it is what I call it, industrial watchmaking. You have a vibrating fan with 120 decibel noise coming out and a new 600-seat auditorium within 4 inches of that. So it's very, very precise and very, very, very difficult. But again, there's the idea of the public theatre and the public office coming through and connecting up. The benefit of the research and a large team is that it's the most complex BIM model we've ever made. I'm not obsessed with BIM, but it's when you're dealing with this much below ground, it's essential. And then this is the building as it begins to appear within the city, the public space of the office, the kind of expression of the making of it, the idea of the roof terrace, working with an artist on a new public space and the link to Soho Square, revealing a listed church, the theatre itself with its alabaster trims, the box within 2 meters of the edges, and then this very flexible auditorium within. So it contrasts very much that watchmaking idea. When I went to Ahmedabad on a tour of India, and I saw the mill owners building by Le Corbusier, and we were asked to work on this project, which is 1.5 million square feet of offices, 2.5 million square feet of accommodation, with the idea of could we make a building out of only 4 components: concrete, lifting technology, a recessed glazed facade, and a floor-by-floor plant system. And the way, in the sense we've pursued this model, is only through we've resisted other devices and pursued it only through the kind of technology of 3D printing and casting, and then developing organisational ideas for the phase construction of this project, of which this is the latest iteration. I'll end with that image, which is a promise of living, which is really just to say that what's interesting for us, being 400 people around the world, is that we've opened an office in Oklahoma 12 years ago because someone told me that they came from Oklahoma and they thought it was an interesting place. It is an interesting place. It's kind of not known by many Americans. It's certainly not known by me till I went there. But what's been very interesting is kind of displacing ourselves, the comfort level we're in, working in Europe and even India, which we kind of understand, and then coming to a kind of classic burnt-out white flight American city, and being immensely surprised by both the kind of ambition of people there to rebuild their city and rethink their city. So that idea of always displacing yourself, whether you're going for 5 weeks or 5 years or whatever, it's kind of displacement that I think is the kind of greatest asset to creativity. Thank you very much.
Simon, will you take it to questions?
Yeah.
Questions. You referred to this in the end about Oklahoma, but maybe, no, because I think that both what you mentioned about Bristol and Oklahoma. Thank you, Matt. That you had people in the office who wanted to go back to Oklahoma and people who were in the office who wanted to go back maybe to spend time in Bristol. And you encouraged them to then set up a firm. And so part of it is really the kind of expertise that you as a practice can provide, the kind of infrastructure that you can provide to then make people successful in places like Oklahoma or Bristol, which I think is an interesting thing, because I think I'm assuming that it might have been harder for those people to be as successful if they didn't have the backing of the firm. But you might disagree with that, and they might disagree. They might say otherwise. But I'm raising that because you went very seamlessly from like 1999 to 2017.
It's been seamless, Moise. It's been seamless.
The thing is, I was saying to Michael at some point, like 20 minutes ago, you were only at 2007. And then you covered the 10 years in a very short period of time. I mean, and the reason I mention that is that there is a level of kind of sophistication and complexity where the first projects, in a way, are interesting, but they're very, in a way, they're normative, right? But the projects that you're working on now, they involve very complicated infrastructure, whether it's how you're plugging into the rail system or whether it's how you are transforming
the post office building and its structure and overlaying it with another structure. And you kind of like made it seem as if it was just like you did the pool house and now you're doing this. But it seems to me that, the argument about the relationship of architecture to its site has shifted quite a lot in terms of your most recent projects, because the complexity of organization, technology, what is existing, the connection to the city, it speaks of a different idea of architecture, which is, in a different way at the intersection of architecture and the city in some ways. And it's not the historic idea of architecture and the city. So I'm just interested in this question of the role of complexity, the role of technology, the role of how sophisticated the practice needs to be. Of course, a lot of that is due to Hanif and how Hanif and AKT have helped. No, but I would be interested more about your observations.
I don't think the architecture's changed, the opportunity's changed. So when we're in the early days, our view always is to make a project as simple as it can possibly be, as legible as it can be, with as few components as possible. Therefore, when we do something, we have a thing, I don't know if you have it in America, we have it in England, they call it value engineering, which has nothing to do with engineering or value.
It originated in America now.
Okay. It's called stripping out anything of any interest, is what we call it. And so what we've always thought is, if you get down to the essence of the opportunity, if the building is very small and simple, like Kaster, there's one opportunity when you're working that cheaply, and that is to make the circulation special. The accommodation is perfectly nice. We detail the kitchens and bathrooms very nicely. There's some nice balconies and there's some decent brickwork. But at that scale, there's only the opportunity to pursue a simple and legible idea. As the projects get more complicated, we're still trying to make it simple. It's just there's more complexity in it. There's more complexity in the scale, in what we're doing technologically, in terms of the different programs we might be incorporating. We have more knowledge, so you've built up a body of knowledge. You've built up more buildings. So in the early days, when you present a building, they always say, well, can you do it? Now they kind of assume we can do it, and they kind of often think we might know more than they do about how you do it, or it's a very open conversation. So we're still trying to make things as simple as we possibly can. It's just that as we deal with larger projects, they have greater complexity, which is why I showed India after number 1 Oxford Street, because India is 4 or 5 times as big as a project, but we're trying to reduce that to only 4 packages to give it a constraint, because we think we know there'll be limited maintenance, we know it's a tough climate, we know that the building technologies are kind of different, challenging in another kind of way. And it contrasts with number 1 Oxford Street, where the legal, I think we've earned £15 million in fees on that job over the last 10 years. I've had 20 people on it forever. And when I'm designing it with the team back in 2007, we know it's not going to be built for 10 years. So it's kind of slightly strange thing to be designing, knowing it's not going to happen for 10 years, knowing that you'll probably end up redesigning it. We are still, the same thinking is underpinning what we're doing, which is kind of the idea of convergence, an idea of simplicity, about an idea of kind of the importance of time in architecture, an idea about actually allowing things we don't know about, and kind of the uncertain and doubt to exist. The thing is, obviously, as we've grown as a practice, the opportunities and the scale of the problems we've been dealing with have become greater. And in that sense, I find them more interesting. I find putting 8 buildings in Camden Lock more interesting than doing a loft conversion in Camden Lock, which we used to do when we started. And then you get a railway line going through it, and a canal, and Victorian infrastructure, and you're kind of working in those are the visible constraints, and there's invisible constraints. But to me, it goes back to that comment about, without problems, there's no design. The reason we like the greater complexity is there's more constraint on us, there's more challenges, and that makes us think harder. Whereas India, there's no constraint. With quite a lot of Indian bureaucratic regulations, but there's no real formal constraint. So we have to invent our own constraints of a minimal set of, manufacturing systems as a way of controlling the tendency of architecture, in my book, to kind of run away. Going back to the comment by that friend of mine, we can only do so much with architecture. I love it. I think it's really a great thing to be involved in. but actually life carries on around architecture. It matters hugely to us. Cities probably matter more than buildings. But as I'm in the business generally of making buildings, the most interesting challenge I can have is to be putting suites of buildings together and then making pieces of city.
Great. Well, I'm still wondering whether one doesn't need a different kind of language to describe the moment at which trying to simplify the complexity still produces new forms of complexity, and how do you discuss that in architecture? But I'll let Volkan.
Well, thank you for the talk. It's very interesting, and I've followed your work for a long time. I mean, I recall sitting in Manuel Levet's office, and we're designing an academy, and we're looking at your drawings, trying to understand the organizational system. And I recall also that your firm was pretty much every week on BD covers and these things. So it's great to see the practice grow and where it is now. But as a kind of comment or maybe slight question, I want to say that I think that it's very interesting to see that you're interested in quite important architectural or disciplinary questions. And I want to go back to the kind of original diagram you showed about the theater, which is, for me, positioned in the city. The theater has several components. There's constituencies, there's a stage, there's an audience, there's actors, and there's many things that go around. And I feel like you're interested in kind of mixing these things and re-questioning how they are composed. And then if you look into the architecture, I think the way you're doing that is by actually challenging typologies. I think that many of the projects you showed have, atriums and staircases, and some other important kind of public spaces. And it seems like you're interested in always like merging things, hybridizing things, in order to see what actually happens with those spaces and how people behave in them, how they navigate through these things. So I was wondering if you have noticed post-occupation, if these things actually, if there's any surprises that happen in those spaces that you created, because for me they're kind of all hybrid typologies. They're not anymore just an atrium or just a staircase or just things where they converge. I mean, you're mixing art with fashion, you're mixing school children with sports. So maybe you can talk about a little bit how that. Are there any surprises that you discovered after the fact?
There are some quite hardcore technical surprises we've discovered. Is that sophisticated clients don't know how to run their buildings, which is why we've ended up going back to simpler buildings. I mean, just technologically, people, the most sophisticated people, even an environmental engineering company we work with in a building we're in, everyone's got fans on their desk and no one's using the system. So that's a simple kind of example of the surprise. In terms of, going back to that map of London, I think what's become increasingly important to us is the idea of mirroring the uncertainty of chance encounter in the city. So that, the Osbert Lancaster picture is really talking about the fact that what happens, the reason people don't live in barns and the reason they come to cities is for the kind of chance social encounter. We overstructure things in cities now. We regulate things and people curate buildings, which I find slightly weird. I think we should be allowing, I think we used to talk about, instead of mixed use, we used to talk about misuse, the kind of uncertain condition of the city. And so what we've always found is we are looking for simplicity, but we're finding there's enough complexity coming out of working out public circulation systems through buildings, and that we like the fact that as we go and do post-occupancy work, we discover they are doing things quite differently that we hadn't thought of, and they're appropriating spaces in different kinds of way. And even at the white collar, the public space, even before it's opened, people are kind of setting up shop there and doing their own thing. And we talked a lot about that in the design of that thing, about if you're allowing life to happen. The greatest challenge is persuading clients to think about the benefits of that, and not obviously public art, an arts organisation with an art gallery will think about it, but a lot of people have spent the last 50 years working how to keep people out of their buildings. And what we're saying is if you're more generous, a bit like the city, then they will work. In terms of hybridisation, to me it's about the specific and the generic. If we're making space, we're moving people through it. Amsterdam, we're moving through a different way than we are in London, because Amsterdam, we couldn't put new lifts in because there was no budget for them, there was no shafts, and we couldn't make the structure work, so we rethought the role of the staircase. But when you do that, then when you come back to London and do another building, you're kind of learning from that thing. And so it's the uncertainty in your own things, and not having absolute certainty and conviction is also quite useful as you're designing a project, recognizing, well, you know, that thing we thought was going to work one way hasn't worked that way, but it's worked another way. And if you're going to push clients along, what we always say is if we give them a retreat position, they can be more brave. So we'll say, well, let the public come through, let them use your building, let them go up to the garden. But if that causes you great concern down the line, we design a set of retreat mechanisms that you can kind of close the building down. So you've kind of got to manage things politically and architecturally, and you've got to have a clear vision of why you're doing it and what you're setting up, and that, you know, how the hybrids might work, and that's, you know, the chance encounter idea. But it requires a lot of persuasion. But we are lucky enough to, by working with people over 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 projects, you can continuously build on. So I always think it's innovation by iteration rather than the great leap forward. The trouble with the great leap forward is you don't have enough time to learn. I like great leaps, but you don't have enough time to learn, and you will find few people who are prepared to fund that leap forward. So if you can kind of do it across a series of projects, you can take someone on a journey and learn. And also, we're pretty open to kind of hear a contrary view from people of what we're doing. We find that pretty useful. So we can be quite difficult in the office about what we're doing and why we're doing it. But when we're out the office, we can look like we're very collaborative because actually it's quite useful. I mean, we architects have been beaten up over the last 20 years with public consultation, and we get roundly abused. But I don't kind of mind, because I think it kind of forces, I mean, I don't like it at the time, but actually it forces us to think a bit harder. When we get rebuffed by planning, I don't necessarily agree with the planners or Historic England, you know, or in Amsterdam by the aesthetic committee they have. But in a sense, it kind of forces you to think harder. So to me, it's always that idea about accepting that threat and that challenge, and kind of trying to find out what's underpinning it.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. I'd like to go back to a question that you posed at the beginning of the talk, when you said kind of what is the role of the practice in training and educating architects today. And I was wondering if you could talk maybe specifically about the ways that your firm engages with that process of training and educating.
Well, I mean, I think like most people here, we've always been involved in teaching and practice. You know, it's not unique to us. When I was at the RIBA, which is just, you know, one of those things you do a few hours a week, there was this thing about, you know, the educational model. And a lot of my friends who are running schools of architecture used to say to me, you need at least 3 years to get them through the degree, and at least 2 years in the diploma. And my view was actually, I've met students who after 3 years are better than some people who will do as many diplomas as they like and will never get through. So what we suggested was, we had this idea of teaching practices. It's partly also an economical model, because we used to have free education and it's not so strong now. But basically, until 1958 in the UK, most people didn't go to architecture school. They went and studied in a practice. I'm not saying that's great, and the reason somewhere like the AA was formed is they didn't think it was great either, and they wanted academic input. But I think a hybrid, talking about the hybrid thing, a hybrid of actually academe experience. I mean, many of the great architects never entered an architecture school. You know, if you've been working a building site for 5 years, or you're a joiner or something, you're going to have a different set of skills to someone who's been through an architectural school. So what I encouraged was this idea that you can, as it used to be, you can go through many different ways. So we've got 48 schools in England. There's more opening every year, which is kind of fine. But there's a new school, for instance, that's been set up based on that principle called the London School for Architecture. They take diploma students, and those diploma students spend a year in an office where they're earning money, working for 3 days, and they're doing their own work for 2 days within the office itself. What then happens is the people in the office who are, kind of asked to mentor those people through that process. They have their own external tutors and programs, but those people are kind of taking responsibility for developing the talent within the office, which frankly is no different to what we do anyway with anyone coming to the office. Is we're there to help develop talent, because if we're going to be any good as a practice, it's only because the people who pass through our office are interested while they're there in what they're doing. So in a sense, as I said at the very beginning, I don't really see a difference between academe and practice. The only problem is that practice, when it doesn't engage with academe, becomes more and more dreary. And academe, when it doesn't engage with practice, becomes less and less relevant, let's say. So the ebb and flow between the two, the recognition that everyone's just interested in architecture, whatever that might be, is a much more positive place. I still think there's much opportunity to do further masters and PhDs, maybe to do them at different speeds, maybe to do them at different points in your career. And the rather, architecture education has mapped this. We finish buildings, we do go back, but we don't go back, and life gets on with it. And it's a bit like that. We finish architecture education, you're 23, you're done, you're out, slam, bang, and off you go into practice. It's the same thing. You're going to continue learning in practice as you learned in academe. So mixing it up seems to me a healthy kind of disruption to the kind of the old system, which was not that old anyway. It was new.
Simon, thank you very, very much for really
Pleasure.
a wonderful talk and lots of discussion to follow. Thank you all for coming.